It's amazing, isn't it, how quickly things change? I mean, especially with this war in Ukraine. Feels like every time we think we've got a handle on what's happening, boom, something new pops up.
Yeah, the news cycle, it never really lets up, does it?
No, it really doesn't. So today we're going to try to make sense of some of these, well, I guess you could say curveballs.
Hmm.
You sent over some pieces from the Times of India about some pretty bold moves Putin's been making.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, there's that really powerful article from the BBC, the one that gives us a look at what Ukrainian soldiers fighting, get this, inside Russia are going through.
Right, right. I think those are good examples of how we can miss the forest for the trees sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to get so caught up in those day-to-day headlines that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
It's like we're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but without the picture on the box.
That's a great analogy, actually. So think of today as, well, us playing detective a little bit. We're going to try to connect these seemingly random events and figure out what they tell us about where this whole conflict is headed. What's the bigger picture? What's the, I guess, the overall story here?
Yeah, that's the mission. Going beyond just reporting what's happening, right? We're diving into the why and the how, and honestly, the human cost,
Yeah.
which can get lost in all the political maneuvering.
Right. So, to start, let's talk about Putin. The Times of India articles, they kind of paint a picture of a leader who's not just playing chess, but playing it aggressively on multiple boards.
Yeah, multiple boards. Good way to put it.
Like, there's that incident where he publicly called out that German CEO, for speaking English at a forum in Russia.
Yeah, that got some
It
attention.
did. And it's easy to just dismiss that as, oh, that's just Putin being Putin. But I feel like there's got to be a deeper strategy going on there.
I agree. I mean, this is a leader, remember, who sees himself as restoring Russia's greatness. And to him, that means challenging the West, challenging what he sees as their dominance.
Right. And telling that CEO in his own country, why are you speaking English? That sends a message. It's like, a very deliberate poke in the eye.
It definitely signals that defiance, and it plays well to that sense of national pride, that idea independence that Putin really pushes.
It does. And it's interesting how he also responded to all those German companies pulling out of Russia. He's blaming it on the West, of course, as it's all their pressure.
Right.
But it really highlights, I think, the economic tightrope that everyone's walking because of this war.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, wars are incredibly expensive, and not just in terms of, well, the lives lost. They disrupt economies, force businesses to make really tough choices. And the ripple effects, well, we're only beginning to understand those.
And Putin knows that. And he's trying to use it, to his advantage any way he can.
He's a master strategist. You got to give
Yeah.
that.
And it's not like he has just this one conflict on his plate. I mean, there's all this going on in Ukraine, and then we have his involvement in Syria. The Times of India article, it talks about how Russian forces backed the Syrian army in this massive offensive, basically crushed a rebel group. Casualties were in the thousands, and the article specifically mentions Russia's air power being key to that victory.
Yeah, classic Putin, right? He's not just fighting on one front. He's very strategically intervening in multiple conflicts, projecting Russian power beyond its borders.
It's a reminder, I think, that his ambitions, well, they extend far beyond Ukraine.
Much further. He wants to be seen as a major player on the global stage, and he's willing to use force, military force, to get there.
But then, we have that BBC article, and it
Right.
tells a very, very different story. We go from these big power plays to, well, exhaustion, disillusionment even. We see things from the perspective of those Ukrainian soldiers, the ones fighting inside Russia.
Right, and that's where the reality of war, the human reality of war, really hits home.
It does. We can talk about all this strategy and these geopolitical moves, but at the end of the day, it's individuals, real people who are paying the price.
Exactly. And these soldiers, well, they're not sugarcoating anything. They're painting a bleak picture. The constant shelling, the fatigue, just this overall sense that they're being sacrificed and for goals they don't even understand.
One of the quotes that really stuck with me, one soldier said, "The main task facing us is to hold the maximum territory until Trump's inauguration." I mean, can you imagine feeling like that? Like your life is hinging on a U.S. election?
Yeah, wow. And they clearly feel like pawns in a game they have absolutely no control over.
And it makes you wonder, who benefits from all of this, from their sacrifice? I mean, are those benefits even aligned with what's good for Ukraine long term?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And then there's the part where these soldiers are even drawing comparisons to these historical battles, which, I don't know, it's like they're suggesting that the same mistakes are being made all over again. They talk about the Kursk operation and the fight for the Krinky bridgehead. Those were brutal, costly battles.
It's true. And they were incredibly controversial, too. A lot of debate about whether those sacrifices were even worth it.
Right. And it's a reminder that decisions about war, about military strategy, well, those are being made in rooms, in offices, far removed from the front lines.
And sometimes those decisions, even if they're well-intentioned, they can lead to immense suffering.
And those anxieties that these soldiers have about the future, they're actually, it's interesting, they're mirrored in some of the things Zelensky's been saying recently. That Al Jazeera article you sent, it covers some of that.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating piece of the puzzle.
Because he seems to be signaling, Zelensky, that he's willing to negotiate a peace, but not just any peace, one that doesn't necessarily involve retaking all of that lost territory right away.
It's a shift, for sure.
He's talking about securing what's currently under Ukrainian control, getting that under NATO protection, and then dealing with the occupied areas through diplomacy later.
Which, I mean, that's a major change from his previous stance, right?
Right.
What's fascinating to me is that it seems like he's acknowledging that a total military victory, well, that might not be possible right now, at least not in the short term.
The Al Jazeera article, they call it a major compromise. And he even admits that the Ukrainian army, well, they might not be strong enough to take back everything by force.
Right. There are a lot of factors at play here, obviously.
Yeah.
But the reality on the ground, just how brutal this war has been, the potential change in U.S. policy if Trump wins, and there are even polls showing that within Ukraine there's a growing desire for peace. It's a tough, tough call. But it seems like Zelensky's trying to adapt. I mean, he's dealing with an incredibly complex situation.
Okay, so let's try to sum this up. We've got Putin making these bold power moves. We've got Zelensky hinting at compromise. And of course, you've got the entire global landscape shifting under all of this.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
It really is. So what does it all mean? What's the takeaway here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's exactly what we're going to dive into next.
Yeah.
It really is the million-dollar question, and not an easy one to answer. I mean, we know compromise is usually how conflicts end, right?
Right.
But with someone like Putin, you have to wonder, what message does it send, when you make concessions? Because he's shown time and again that he's willing to use force, military force, to get what he wants.
That's what worries me, I guess. Will any concession, anything Zelensky gives, just embolden him further? I mean, look what happened with Crimea. He took that back in 2014, and now he's gone and declared all these other territories as part of Russia.
And that's the pattern, isn't it?
Yeah.
Takes something, declares it as part of Russia.
It's hard to imagine him just backing down, giving up any of that territory easily.
And then you throw in that potential shift in U.S. policy, if Trump wins.
Right.
If Ukraine's main ally is backing away, even a little, that puts Zelensky in a really, really tough spot. It could force his hand, pressure him to make concessions that he wouldn't even consider otherwise.
It's like you're playing this high-stakes game of poker,
With incredibly high stakes.
and we're stuck on the outside trying to figure out what cards they're holding.
Exactly. We're never going to know for sure what's happening, behind closed doors. But we can look at the information we do have, the historical context, even just try to understand what seems to be motivating each player.
Right. That's the best we can do. So, okay, let's talk about motivations then. Let's start with Putin. What is his end game here? Is it about rebuilding this, I don't know, this grand Russian empire? Is he just after strategic territory? Or is there something else going on entirely?
My guess. It's probably a combination of things. I mean, there's definitely some historical revisionism going on, right? Harkening back to when Russia, held more sway in the world. Taking Crimea was a big part of that narrative. And what he's doing in eastern Ukraine, it seems to be following a similar playbook.
Right, and he keeps saying he wants to protect Russian speakers in those regions, talking about these historical ties. But it feels like it's more than just nostalgia, right?
Oh, it's definitely more than that. There are absolutely strategic interests at play, too. Access to warm water ports, control over key resources, all of that.
The Black Sea region, that's incredibly important, both economically and militarily. And Putin's definitely making moves to reassert Russia's control there.
Absolutely. But I think there's a crucial domestic political angle to all of this as well.
What do you mean by that?
By portraying himself as this strong man, the leaders standing up to the West, reclaiming what he claims is Russia's rightful territory, well, it helps him solidify support at home.
Nationalism, you're saying. That's a powerful tool.
Oh, incredibly powerful, especially when you tie it to this idea that Russia has been wronged, that they've been pushed around by the West.
It's a tactic that, well, it's been used before, but it's clearly working for him.
It is, which makes it even harder to predict how he'll react to all of this talk about Zelensky, maybe shifting toward negotiation.
Right.
Will he see it as weakness, as a chance to push for even more? Or could he actually be open to a real dialogue, one that might actually lead to lasting peace?
It's almost impossible to know, but even Putin has to have limits, right? I mean, yes, he might be willing to use force, but I can't see him wanting to get bogged down in a long, drawn-out conflict.
Especially one that could hurt Russia's economy even more, which, let's face it, is already in a pretty rough spot.
So you're saying maybe the economic pain, the cost of all this, could actually push things toward peace?
It's possible. If things get bad enough, Putin might have to change his tune.
Interesting. But it's not just about Putin and Zelensky, right? There are other global players we have to consider, like China, for example. They've been trying to walk this really fine line, keeping their relationship with Russia good, but without, getting too directly involved in the conflict itself.
China's influence is only growing. What they do, what stance they take, it's crucial.
And how would a peace agreement, if one actually happens, how would that change the whole power dynamic? I mean, between the U.S., China, and Russia, it's like this massive geopolitical chess match.
It is, and the outcome, well, it's going to have consequences far beyond just this region.
So we've got all of these things going on, it seems like. Historical grievances, anxieties about the economy, this pursuit of power and influence on the world stage. And then, we can't forget the human cost of all of this. All the people caught in the middle.
And that's what we have to remember. The lives that have been lost, the families torn apart, the trauma, that's going to last long after any fighting stops.
It's a reminder, I think, that war is never a simple solution, no matter what the reasons for it are.
It's a call to action, in my mind, for all of us to work toward a more peaceful world, a world where we choose dialogue and diplomacy instead of violence and aggression.
I like that. Well said. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's come back to the situation at hand. Zelensky's hinted that he's open to negotiating, but what would a peace agreement actually look like? And how likely is it that we'll actually get one? That's what we'll explore next. I don't know, trying to predict what a peace agreement might look like. I mean, it feels like, I don't know, reading tea leaves or something.
It's really hard to say.
So many different interests, everyone positioning themselves. What are the main issues that would have to be tackled?
Well, yeah, like you said, it's complicated. But the biggest hurdle, probably the status of those territories, the occupied territories.
Right.
Is Putin really going to give those up? Crimea? The regions he's already declared as part of Russia?
And what would Zelensky even be willing to concede to get to peace, to make it happen?
It's a really tough question.
From what we've seen so far, I mean, it's just hard to imagine Putin backing down. He's put so much on the line, his image, his standing, everything, all to take these territories.
He's framed it as a matter of Russian security, historical justice, all of that. So yeah, he's not going to just let go of those areas easily. I mean, there's a real chance of more fighting, more digging in, if that's what it takes for him to hold on.
But Zelensky's in a difficult position too, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, he can't be seen as just surrendering land, giving it up to an aggressor. His people have fought so hard, and they expect him to protect their country, their interests.
Right, and that's what makes this such a tightrope walk. He needs to find a solution that keeps as much of Ukraine intact as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Their territory, their independence, but it also has to acknowledge, well, the reality on the ground.
Yeah.
And the fact that people really want peace.
So, okay, what are some possible scenarios? I mean, could there be some kind of compromise? Maybe where Russia slowly withdraws troops from some areas in exchange for, I don't know, security guarantees, or maybe even some kind of recognition of those annexations.
I mean, there has been talk about maybe holding referendums in those disputed areas, but that's tricky.
Yeah.
That's really tricky. I mean, with Russian forces still there, how do you guarantee a fair vote? It's hard to see that satisfying anyone. It could even just make things worse.
Yeah, it feels like that could just lead to more conflict down the road.
Exactly. Not a real solution. Another option maybe is some kind of international administration or a peacekeeping force, at least for a while, just to create some stability while everyone tries to figure out a longer-term solution.
But that sounds, I don't know, it sounds messy.
It could be.
Who would control those forces? What would their mission be?
Lots of potential for things to go wrong there, for sure.
And it seems like it all comes back to this question of security guarantees for Ukraine. If they're not going to be a part of NATO, then what? What kind of promises are they going to get from the West? from the U.S. I mean, how do they know? How can they be sure that Russia won't just invade again in a few years?
That's a thing, isn't it?
Can Zelensky really trust Putin at this point? And will the U.S., I mean, will they actually commit to defending Ukraine in the long term? I mean, look at what happened with the Budapest Memorandum.
Right.
Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons they did for security guarantees. And then what? Russia invaded anyway.
It happens. International agreements, they can be fragile.
Right.
Especially if powerful countries decide they're not convenient anymore.
Exactly. So any new guarantees, any new promises, they would have to be rock solid with real consequences if they're broken.
Mm-hmm.
But that level of commitment from the West, well, it's not guaranteed, especially with this potential U.S. policy shift, if Trump wins.
Yeah, it's a lot to ask, especially now.
It's a gamble for Zelensky, a huge gamble.
He really has to weigh those risks and benefits.
And then there's the question of war crimes. All the reports of atrocities. Will anyone be held accountable?
That's difficult territory.
It is.
Legally, politically, it's a minefield. Setting up an international tribunal, that would be a long and difficult process, and honestly, it's not even clear that Russia or Ukraine would agree to participate.
It seems like so often justice for the victims, it just gets lost in all the politics.
Yeah, it's a sad truth about war.
It is.
But even if a formal tribunal doesn't happen, there's still truth and reconciliation, acknowledging the harm and finding a way to move forward somehow.
So we have all these potential roadblocks, all these complicated issues. It's hard to be optimistic about a lasting peace, a real peace agreement.
I agree. It's a really, really daunting situation.
What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, history's shown us that even the toughest conflicts, they can eventually be resolved. If there's dialogue and a willingness to find common ground, it takes time and patience, a real commitment to peace from everyone.
I hope you're right. But this war, I mean, even if they reach an agreement, it's changed things. It's changed everything. It's reshaped the map, the geopolitical map. It's created so much mistrust. And the suffering, well, that's not going to go away easily.
No, you're right. It's a reminder, I think, for all of us to keep paying attention, to try to understand what's happening, and to work for a future, a future where peace and diplomacy, well, where those are the norm and not the exception.
Well said. And for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive, we hope it's helped shed some light on all of this, on the Russia-Ukraine war, what it all means for the region, for the world. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.